Okay, so before there will be the presentation, the PowerPoint. I would like to thank to the whole organizational team of the iSeries for putting together this amazing event, and also thank you for having me and providing me this opportunity to share some of my ideas. First, I would like to introduce myself very briefly so you have an idea who is talking to. My name is Rita Kočárová, and I'm a psychologist. I got into the closer contact with the psychedelics many years ago, and as a student of psychology, I realized that that's maybe the most interesting thing I can focus on in my further studies, and so I did. Since then, for the last 7 years, I did the research on ayahuasca in the treatment of addictions, then continued in the National Institute of Mental Health, working in the psilocybin clinical trial. I did also an observational study on the effect of secretion from Bufo alvarius toad, and currently starting the project which should have as a result the proposal for the system of services for the psychedelic users in Czech Republic. Before I will proceed to introduce you to the topic of my topic today, I have a few questions for you. So, if you would agree, I would like to ask you if you could raise a hand, those of you who have had some psychedelic experience, either with ayahuasca or any other psychedelic. Okay, maybe almost all of you. That's not that surprising in this kind of events. And now, if you could raise a hand, those of you who took psychedelics for another reason than treatment of some kind of mental health disorder. Okay, again, almost all of you. And now just keep your hands up, those of you who believe that this experience helped you to maintain your mental health, or maybe even possibly to avoid the development of some mental health disorder. Okay, maybe at least half of you. So what I'm going to talk today here is probably not that novel idea, but it doesn't change the fact that, in my opinion, it's not appropriately reflected in the current psychedelic science, and that's why I decided to bring this topic here, and hopefully to facilitate the discussion and maybe further research. Because the current psychedelic science focuses on the treatment of mental health disorders, either depressions, anxieties, post-traumatic syndromes, or addictions, and others. But I'm thinking, like, if on the same principle as it is universal to treat a variety of disorders, it could also help us to stay healthy. I would like to emphasize that this idea is still on the level of hypothesis. It means that we don't have enough scientific evidence to say that this hypothesis could be confirmed. Yeah, I would like to thanks to all the people who have helped me to develop this idea further, especially to my supervisor, Professor Jiří Horáček from the institution, and even more to Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, who helped a lot to develop this idea in a more profound and rigorous way, but also to many others. So we as a humanity have a problem. We have many problems, but I believe that by resolving the problem of mental health we are facing, this world could be a much better place to live. All those numbers you see there are making the mental health disorders one of the leading causes of the disability worldwide. And even more, we already know that the available treatment is not sufficient to efficiently address those issues, this problem. And also we know that the burden of mental health problems is increasing. And so we have this growing problem, which constitutes one of the main challenges we face as a humanity, and we are failing to address it appropriately. So I'm thinking, isn't it better maybe to offer the people a tool to prevent the desperation? So it's 15 years ago, World Health Organization already released a bulletin where they claim that prevention of mental health disorders should become a priority in mental health care, because it's still not reflected as much as when we talk about the physical diseases, and that it's maybe the only way how we can really efficiently deal with the global mental health challenge. The development of mental health disorders is a complex process. So there are different factors which contribute to the development of some kind of issue, either on the social and cultural context where we grow up, where we live, if we have the experience of violence or another traumatic event, but also the genetical factors. And we also know about the personality and psychological factors which make people more vulnerable to develop any mental health disorder. We will focus on this group of psychological factors mainly because my background is psychology. The research on psychopathology has identified underlying mechanisms and processes which can be recognized across the different disorders as classified by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And there is a growing interest in those processes which we call transdiagnostic. That it is growing into popularity. And you can see that it's very pretty recent concept also when I did this search in PubMed and looked for the papers which had the word transdiagnostic in its title. And more than 3/4 then the publications have been released during the last 5 years. Probably because it is a pretty emerging concept, there is no consensual definition of what transdiagnostic processes means. But as we understand it and as we work with this further, mean that we talk about the psychological processes which are recognized across different disorders, and their level, depending on their level, they can be risk or protective factors of mental health. And so generally there are important correlates of mental health and often become a focus of some preventative strategies. So I listed here some psychological processes which could fit into this category of transdiagnostic processes. And all of them have in common as well that we have already an evidence showing that the use of psychedelics in some kind of controlled setting could enhance those processes. Because those processes or constructs are often overlapping, and as well there are often pretty blurry definitions of them, we decided to work with to pick the psychological construct of mental flexibility, which we consider to be effective as an umbrella construct for all those processes we have mentioned before. When we talk about mental flexibility, if I would use an analogy with body, we talk about when we talk about enhancing the mental flexibility, we talk about something like stretching or yoga for, or in the context of psychedelic therapy, maybe rather looks like this. So. Enhancement of all those processes basically gives you wider range of how to respond to the situations and we encounter every day, including those stressful or traumatic. and thus giving you the opportunity to pick some of the responses which would be more adaptive, and thus helping you to avoid the option to develop some mental health disorder. So if we connect it to another fields of the psychedelic therapy, the spiritual experience or ego dissolution, which is also pretty well correlated together, spiritual experience is considered one of the main therapeutic factors of the psychedelic therapy, and it is also correlated with the improvements in mental health. When we talk about the mystical experience or ego dissolution, we often talk about the unity or connectedness with the environment or with each other. And we propose that on the neurological level, we can observe it as a global interconnectivity in between the different brain regions. So what we would like to propose is that we are maybe talking about the same principle, which we call with different names when seeing it perceived from different angles. And that what we experience as a spiritual experience and see as a global interconnectivity on the brain can be kind of extreme mental flexibility. Just the psychological science doesn't have the tools to measure the mental flexibility in those extreme states during the psychedelic use. So we have gone through some of the mechanism of action of psychedelics, but that would not be enough to support the hypothesis that psychedelics could have a prophylactic effect. Luckily, we have also some evidence showing that there are correlations between the psychedelic use and weak or stronger positive correlation with the mental health. We have also studies showing that users of psychedelics have better mental health than the non-users. So there are for sure many limitations, like most of those studies I have reviewed here and presented here have very weak methodological design, which we should keep in mind. Also, from most of them we cannot suggest the causality, but rather correlations. Also, there were different dosages, substances, and context when those studies have been done. And lastly, there are many risks of psychedelics, which is not the topic of this presentation. I just would like to mention that I'm aware of them and grateful that it was mentioned in the previous presentations to some extent. So, a brief summary. Growing number of mental health, we have a growing number of mental health problems and insufficient mental health treatment available. Therefore, the prevention possibly should become an essential part of the mental health care system, and the transdiagnostic approach could be a key. And those processes, transdiagnostic processes, can be enhanced by the psychedelic therapy. And therefore, we suggest that the psychedelic experience might have a prophylactic effect. What does it mean? If we agree on that this idea is worth exploring further, then we could focus more on the non-clinical samples in the randomized clinical trials in the context of the mental health care, and not looking simply on how does it change the personality or psychological processes of the people. I believe that the psychedelic science could, by doing this, could help to bring more attention to the prevention and promotion of mental health, to the world mental health care system. So, if we decide to explore it further, then we would need much more, where are we now? Yeah. Then we would need much more research to be done, and not just randomized clinical trials, which are golden standard in the research of the treatment and therapies. But also to conduct the longitudinal epidemiological studies which are more suitable for exploring the potential of what can serve as a prevention, because we are talking here about whole communities and populations in the long-term perspective. And also, let's keep in mind that this idea in the clinical science is in the early beginning, which means that we suppose already that the protocols for use of psychedelics in this context would be very different from the treatment protocols we have developed already. And so we would need to explore what dosages, from what time, how often should be done redosing, what would be contraindications and indications, and many other things, basically to create the whole protocols and the context for the use in this area. But in spite of a lot of energy and time and work we would need to give to explore this idea further, I still believe that it's worth it, because considering the impact of the mental health problems we are experiencing nowadays, if this hypothesis would prove to be valid, then it could have the massive and broad impact on the mental health care, and also in the public health, and how the society perceives the mental health and also psychedelics. So I'm suggesting here the radical change of perspective, to see the psychedelics and psychedelic therapy not just a tool for the becoming healthy again, but also to simply stay healthy, so no other treatment is necessary. And I'm aware of that there might be the huge risks and costs, and that it will be too big to even work on this idea. And maybe it will not be supported by the evidence anyway, and maybe we will not be able to develop the proper guidelines on how to work with psychedelics in this context. But anyway, who knows, maybe one day we will all go for example, few years to the psychedelic clinics to take a psychedelic sessions even when we are healthy, in a similar way we now go to get the vaccinations against another diseases. So I will be very interested in hearing some feedbacks or commentaries, so just don't hesitate to approach me when you see me in the space. So thank you so much for your attention, and have a beautiful rest of the conference.